Hi everyone, my name is David, and the title of this series of podcasts is Unmasking Postmodernism and the Woke Crisis Movement. This is episode 1. Beginning with primer number 1, we will be addressing the following question. How did the nonviolent civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s mutate into the violent Antifa and Black Lives Matter movements of today? As you'll notice, I have a block of photos on the left side of the screen which were taken from the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s, while on the right side of this screen I have a second block of photos taken from the Black Lives Matter movement of today. Yes, there have been peaceful marches by the Black Lives Matter movement, but as we shall see, this disingenuous tactic of appearing as a peaceful movement is simply to give it cover under the guise of the earlier and nonviolent civil rights movement. The point is that the Black Lives Matter movement is attempting to brand itself as the new civil rights movement, and all in order to give it a legitimacy and history that it does not deserve nor is capable of emulating. In fact, as I will show, the Black Lives Matter movement is a complete repudiation and betrayal of the earlier civil rights movement, and is currently in the process of reversing all the positive advances of the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s by an inversion and perversion of one of the main tenets and struggles of the civil rights movement, that is, to acknowledge, first and foremost, their humanity over and above their skin color. Let me explain. As is made evident by the numerous signs shown here, displaying the slogan, "I am a man," one can see that the civil rights movement was largely a struggle for human dignity and the acknowledgement of their underlying identity as a man, rather than as a non-human object or thing to be enslaved, belittled, or treated like an animal. Without being acknowledged first and foremost as a man, on a level or par with all other human beings, these civil rights advocates knew they would never obtain the basic civil rights of the white communities and all other human beings. For generations, the black color of their skin had always been held out as a defining and subhuman identity marker. And it was this racist designation that Martin Luther King Jr. correctly decried in his famous "I Have a Dream" speech.
Just as I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today.
With the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s, this battle or struggle for human dignity was won in that one's skin color became secondary and subordinate to the fact that one was a man, deserving all the rights and privileges of being a man. Today, however, and with the advent of identity politics and critical race theory, this is now all being reversed, wherein "I am a man who happens to be black" is being overshadowed by the identity politics of "I am a black man," hence Black Lives Matter, rather than the more universal All Lives Matter. And with this reversal back to placing the color of one's skin ahead of one's humanity, we see the end of the civil rights movement and the end of Martin Luther King Jr.'s dream of not being judged by the color of one's skin, but by the content of one's character. And this is why the Black Lives Matter movement of today is both a repudiation and betrayal of the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s. That this shift away from the positive advancements of the civil rights movement towards the more radical position of the left, with its emphasis on racial tensions and identity politics, has been in the works for decades now, is made obvious once one looks back at the writings of the critical race theorists in the 1990s, such as those of Kimberly Crenshaw, who was one of the originators of critical race theory and the author of the 1993 and influential academic paper titled "Mapping the Margins." which has proven inspirational for the entire intersectionality rhetoric of today that divides, categorizes, and maps out everyone according to identity markers such as race, class, sex, gender, sexuality, and so forth. Listen to what Crenshaw has to say about this shift away from the civil rights movement, with its emphasis on "I am a man who happens to be black," to the more radical political and divisive rhetoric of "I am, first and foremost, a black man." She writes, and I quote, "We all can recognize the distinction between the claims, 'I am black,' and the claim, 'I am a person who happens to be black.' 'I am black' takes the socially imposed identity and empowers it as an anchor of subjectivity. 'I am black' becomes not simply a statement of resistance, but also a positive discourse of self-identification, intimately linked to celebratory statements like the black nationalist 'Black is beautiful.' 'I am a person who happens to be black,' on the other hand, achieves self-identification by straining for a certain universality. In effect, I am first a person, and for a concomitant dismissal of the imposed category 'black' as contingent, circumstantial, non-determinate." Unquote. We see then that this emphasis on racial identity, "I am black," falls in line with the Black Lives Matter movement of today, while the non-racial rhetoric of "I am a man who happens to be black," or "I am first a person," harks back to Martin Luther King Jr. and the civil rights movement of yesteryears. To fully understand the strategic intent and awful impact of this step backwards by the radical and progressive left to put skin color and racial tensions front and center once more, we need to look beneath the surface tensions that manifest themselves outwardly in the racially charged protests, looting, and riots in the street, to the far more subtle and negative impact to racial relations in general, including the impact on interracial marriages of today. Take, for example, this happy scene at a petting zoo, wherein we have all the signs of a loving relationship between a family man who happens to be black and his wife who happens to be white, as well as the mother of his child. There is no indication of racial tension in this family portrait whatsoever. In fact, we have just the opposite impression. The point is that we can thank Martin Luther King Jr. and the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s for this momentous change in attitude, wherein the interracial marriages of today are no longer seen as abhorrent or socially unacceptable as in times past, all of which was made possible by society at large recognizing the fact that "I am a man who happens to be black" is the rational and critical identity marker to be embraced, and not the racially charged and irrational notion of "I am, first and foremost, a black man, and secondly, a person." Sadly, with this critical race theory and identity politics, all this progress in racial relations and in our attitude towards interracial marriages is being undone. In fact, notice what happens to this happy family scene at the petting zoo once we shift to this racially charged and irrational notion that this young man is, first and foremost, a black man, and that this girl, as his wife, is, first and foremost, a white woman, who, according to the critical race theory, is inherently a racist. That is, a racist possessing a false consciousness, incapable of recognizing her own racist tendencies and prejudices, but who instead, as a white person, is unconsciously, consistently, and ignorantly an oppressor of people of color, including an oppressor of her own husband and her own child, while at the same time unapologetically enjoying all the power and privileges of her inherent whiteness. As one can see, this horrific and obnoxious critical race theory will eventually and inevitably tear this happy couple and family apart, and all the more so once we introduced and institutionalized this critical race theory across America, wherein whites are separated from blacks and other people of color in mandatory diversity training sessions, and all in order to bully, shame, and indoctrinate white people into accepting the absurdity of this destructive agenda or ideology of critical race theory, with its divisive, destructive, and incurable notion of systemic racism, which supposedly manifests itself throughout all of society in various forms of white power and white privilege. And yet, one might still ask, how did this nonviolent civil rights movement mutate into its opposite and become this Black Lives Matter movement of today, with an upside-down and equally racist agenda of black this and black that, when the civil rights movement was all about being a man first and foremost, and a colored man second? In other words, what exactly was it that gave rise to identity politics, critical race theory, and the Black Lives Matter movement of today? Let's turn to that question now. The entire story of how the civil rights movement mutated into the Black Lives Matter movement of today is concealed in these two popular political slogans: "Speak truth to power" and "No justice, no peace." On the left, then, we have the political slogan "Speak truth to power," which was part of the earlier civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s, and which phrase originated in a 1955 pamphlet published by the American Friends Service Committee, which was titled, quote, "Speak Truth to Power, a Quaker's Search for an Alternative to Violence," unquote. Now let's contrast that nonviolent phrase or political slogan, "Speak Truth to Power," with the Black Lives Matter political slogan shown here on the right, which militantly declares, "No justice, no peace," a slogan which first appeared in 1986 in Queens, New York City, and then was later coupled with an image of a closed and clenched black fist, suggesting defiance and resistance to the status quo. Unfortunately, the tendency to view the Black Lives Matter movement of today as an extension or the rightful heir of the civil rights movement of yesteryears is all too common. In fact, it is this woke or get woke or stay woke movement of today that is eager to meld or fuse these two movements together out of a self-absorbed desire on the part of the woke community to associate themselves with and somehow participate in the original civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s by marching in the streets today arm in arm with the Black Lives Matter movement. Sadly, most Americans, including this woke generation of today, are totally unaware of the Marxist agenda and origins of Black Lives Matter, and how utterly foreign this organization is to the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s. And so I am going to let the rapper and libertarian Eric July give you his take or perspective on the Black Lives Matter movement and organization from inside his own radio studio, where he rightly complains about how far too many of this woke community of crackerheads remain oblivious to the obvious. That is, to the obvious fact that the organization behind the Black Lives Matter movement is a Marxist organization, and that at least two of the three co-founders of this Black Lives Matter movement are trained and dyed-in-the-wool Marxist. This video podcast that we are about to listen to is, then, his wake-up call to all those, whites or blacks, who are virtue signaling to each other of their wokeness by financially supporting this organization, and that what they are actually funding and supporting is Marxism, and not some racial equality movement like the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s. In any event, let's hear what he has to say in order to help set the record straight on just exactly who the co-founders of this Black Lives Matter movement are, and as to what their self-declared ideology is.
All right. This video is really designed. This isn't new information, by the way. You've probably seen it start getting around. I wanted to cover it because I believe that it's worthwhile to update people who are oblivious, and some of that in being oblivious is by choice. Okay? So let's watch this. I'm going to give you my thoughts. I'm going to wrap everything up after we watch this. So let's take a look real quick. This is Patrisse Cullors. I have no idea how to say her name. She was one of the founders of Black Lives Matter, the organization that is. Look, there's a separation between when people just say Black Lives Matter generically, it's kind of veered off into its own movement just of people that don't even really understand that there is an organization in some cases. But so they're not the exact same. Obviously they're connected, but they're not the exact same. But we're talking about specifically a founder of one of the three founders of the movement, or the organization, more so, excuse me, in Black Lives Matter. So let's take a look at what she's appearing on some guy's network. I'm not familiar with who this guy is, but she's appearing on this dude's network talking about these different things.
Concerned that that there's a lack of perhaps ideological direction in Black Lives Matter that would allow it to fizzle out, in, as he said, in comparison to Occupy Wall Street.
And so before she answers, basically what he is asking is, there's people that have been within even this movement of struggle that has criticized Black Lives Matter in terms of not having really any ideological direction. He's saying like maybe that has to attribute to like people co-opting the movement and making it theirs and their own. And he said that he's criticized this in the past. So one of the founders, in Patrisse, she's about to answer that specific question as far as them not having, or this criticism that they don't really have an ideological foundation.
I think that the criticism is helpful. I also think that it might, I think of a lot of things. The first thing I think is that we actually do have an ideological frame. Myself and Alicia in particular are trained organizers. We are trained Marxists. We are super on sort of ideological theories.
So basically, she just flat out said it. That's what they're out, and she mentions Alicia. That's another founder, one of the two. So that's two founders, right? That she didn't mention the other, but two of them are admitting right there, like their ideological foundation. Their ideological foundation is Marxism. The trained Marxist. That's exactly what she just admitted. She just said it. That wasn't a secret. I've long known that, but for those of you that have been on the fence with this, you heard it from the horse's mouth. So all of you crackheads that have been centering your last 2 weeks of your life around donating to this organization, you need to understand what you've been funding. You have been funding Marxism, okay? It's not a secret. Anybody that could pick up how they navigate would have been long able to sniff this out. You've been funding Marxists. Admitted, trained Marxists. She just told you, bro. Admitted, trained Marxists. So a lot of you who have been signaling your pants off have been donating money to Marxists. And a lot of you guys are okay with that. That's fine. It's not fine, but whatever. Some of you guys are proud. That's not necessarily who I'm actually talking about. I'm talking to some of you other guys who have been very dishonest, even going as far as to claim people are lying when they say that this movement is attached to Marxism. That's exactly what it's attached to. Marxism is a deadly ideology. It should be shunned. It should be shamed. And I absolutely will continue to do so.
It should be clear then as to the origins and Marxist political ideology of the Black Lives Matter co-founders, and that anyone who argues otherwise are purposely trying to merge these two movements and slogans together, regardless of the facts and regardless of the deception involved. In any event, with the contrast of these two political slogans, the question now becomes, how did we mutate from a nonviolent, speak truth to power political slogan to an obviously militant and Marxist political slogan of no justice, no peace? To explain how this unfortunate transformation came about, I have created a one-page chart to illustrate how this mutation took place in what amounts to be 3 steps, or the merging of 3 powerful ideologies into one. So let's turn to that illustration now. As one can see, I have placed the political slogan of the civil rights movement, Speak Truth to Power, at the top of the chart, and the political slogan of the Black Lives Matter movement, No Justice, No Peace, at the bottom of the chart, with 3 clearly marked blank steps in between, suggesting a 3-step process in mutating from the first nonviolent political slogan at the top to the far more militant political slogan at the bottom. An important point to note is that what stands in between these 2 political slogans are the 3 major topics of this mini-course that you are participating in. That is, postmodernism, progressive liberalism, and cultural Marxism. In any event, what I will be arguing in this set of episodes on the unmasking of postmodernism and the woke crisis movement is that it is the convergence of these 3 destructive ideologies, creating the perfect cultural storm, which accounts for the mutation of the nonviolent civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s into the violent Antifa and Black Lives Matter movements of today. We will be discussing each of these 3 ideologies in detail in future episodes, but for now I would like you to simply learn to associate each of these destructive ideologies with their core or fundamental essence, so that when you think of the one, you think of the other. Whenever you think of postmodernism, then, it is always best to think of it in terms of a radical skepticism that makes speaking the truth to power an impossibility. For if all truth claims are off the table, then speaking truth to power is off the table as well, and one can say goodbye to the nonviolent civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s. Next, we have progressive liberalism, and whenever you think of progressive liberalism, it is always best to think of it in terms of multiculturalism, or what today is called cultural relativism, a cultural and moral relativism which turns each diverse country, culture, and people into a postmodern and progressive playground for all the progressive do-gooders and postmodern know-it-alls that are determined to reshape the world into their own woke image. Finally, we have cultural Marxism, and whenever you think of cultural Marxism, it is always best to think of it in terms of identity politics and the shift away from individual rights to group rights, from individualism to identity markers, and from cosmopolitan to tribal affinities, which, of course, leads us directly to Antifa and the Black Lives Matter movements of today. It is then this convergence or unholy alliance of postmodernism, progressive liberalism, and cultural Marxism of today, with its radical skepticism, cultural relativism, and identity politics, that accounts for the activism and social justice warriors in the streets, and all under the political, racial, and deceptive rallying cry of advancing social justice, but which in truth is no justice at all, at least not in the universal, traditional sense of individual rights and equal justice under the law. Instead, what we have are the Proud Boys on the right and Black Lives Matter on the left fighting it out in the streets, where apparently no lives matter. This threefold unfolding of postmodernism, progressive liberalism, and culture Marxism, then, is how the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s, and with its political ideal of speak truth to power, mutated into the Black Lives Matter and Antifa movements of today, with their political slogan of no justice, no peace. Now it is true that in 1967, during a visit to Santa Rita Jail in California, that the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. uttered similar words when he stated that, and I quote, "There can be no justice without peace, and there can be no peace without justice," unquote. But while the words sounded similar, the political sentiments behind them were not at all along the lines of what postmodernists, progressive liberals, and cultural Marxists mean by these two concepts in our day. So let's wake up and let's speak truth to power in the sense of the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s, and not get caught up aiding and abetting this no justice, no peace movement that is intent on burning the house down, and all in the name of social justice and critical race theory, and with no other goal in mind other than watching it all burn to the ground.
And so I say to you today that I still stand by nonviolence, and I am still convinced, that it is the most potent weapon available to the Negro in his struggle for justice in this country. And the other thing is, I'm concerned about a better world. I'm concerned about justice. I'm concerned about brotherhood. I'm concerned about truth. And when one is concerned about that, he can never advocate violence. Let us be dissatisfied until men and women, however black they may be, will be judged on the basis of the content of their character, not on the basis of the color of their skin. Let us be dissatisfied. Let us be dissatisfied until that day when nobody will shout white power, when nobody will shout black power, but everybody will talk about God's power and human power.